to record.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last International Iranian Economic Association webinar for the year. We have an exciting program for next year, which I'll tell you about if you hang around until the end. Just to tell you that IIEA is a private, non-profit, non-political association of scholars, including yourself. We are interested in the study of economic issues surrounding Iran in the very broadest term. And we're very pleased to have you all here. The IIEA has a number of directors on the board of directors. One of them is, I'm sure you all know, Professor Djavad Salehi-Isfahani. And Djavad is not only a director of the IIEA, but will also be chairing this session. So you don't want to hear from me. I'm just going to hand straight over to Djavad. Djavad, over to you.
Thank you, Kamyar. And thank you for everyone for logging in to participate. And many thanks to Esfandiar and Maasoumi for accepting our invitation to give the second keynote address for the IIEA annual conference that's being dispersed over several months, given the circumstances we live in. I want to introduce briefly Esfandiar, or we all call him Essi. I don't know how he signs his papers. So I'm going to introduce Essi briefly and then hand it over to him. He will speak hopefully for not more than 50 minutes. And if you care to ask a question, please put them on the Q&A, and I will monitor that. And I'll sometimes ask the questions on your behalf, maybe combine questions to put it to Essi at the end. And sometimes I'll ask you to ask the question yourself, in which case Kamyar will promote you so they can speak and be seen. I think this may be not a very large group, so I hope that the discussion, which will have about half an hour. Kamyar, is that true? We have a 2-hour slot or a 1.5 hour slot for this?
We generally have two. We generally have 1.5, but we tend to go to 2 hours.
Okay, so let's aim at the 1.5 hour, and hopefully we stop in 1 hour introduction and the talk, and then we have half hour for questions. If there are more questions, yeah, I'm happy to stay, and I'm sure Essi, who is really passionate about the stuff he does always, he probably will be the last one to leave this stage. You probably all know Essi. He has been associated with IIEA, but more importantly, he's one of the most prominent Iranian economists. I'm sure now we should start talking about Iranian American economists, but for me, he's an Iranian economist because he cares about Iran. We often talk about Iran. I visit his Facebook page and enjoy reading his comments and seeing his beautiful paintings. But seriously, Maasoumi is the Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of Economics at Emory University. He has been to all the top schools, LSE, MIT, Yale, University of California, on all different campuses. And he got his PhD from LSE. He got all his degrees from LSE. So he's very much an LSE boy. And you can see in the kind of work he does. People who know econometrics know LSE econometrics. He hasn't changed very much. One of the nice things about Essi is that, like there are many econometricians who have 100 papers, published papers. But when you look at his stuff, you see he was onto something very early on, and he kept at it. And he's still working on very similar stuff using entropy, I think. That's my interpretation. I should confess I'm not an econometrician, but he's taken a concept that he must have been attracted to early on and has applied it to inequality, now to mobility, and to information theoretic models. And that's really commendable for young researchers to know what they're interested in. And instead of just looking for papers to publish, is to push a research agenda forward. And I think you can very clearly see that Essi, like other great economists, has been in that category. Essi is the founder of the Econometric Reviews, which is one of the more prominent journals, econometrics journals. And I always say to my friends that the Central Bank of Iran, who sent Essi and Hashemi Pesaran, made a big contribution to the economics profession. It may have not done much in terms of managing money supply in Iran, but to have two prominent journals and two prominent econometricians for the academic community, I think is a very serious contribution of the central bank. Of course, you know that Essi and I know each other from the fact that we were both scholarship students of the central bank. We both went through, he went to LSE, I went to Queen Mary College, and we've kept in touch in part because we considered ourselves as bank students. And I don't know if Hashim is online now, but it's really quite a privilege to have been cohorts with both Hashim and Essi. I am going to turn over now the stage to Essi and let him share his screen, give his talk, and I'll be back when his talk is over. Over to you, Essi.
Well, good morning, everyone. I guess where I am is the morning, but probably late evening or later in the evening in Iran, and everything in between. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present some of my latest work, latest attempts to understand aspects of mobility. I'm thankful to Djavad and Kamyar for initiating this and organizing this, and I'm really proud to be part of this this association that is providing such a wonderful service and opportunity for scholars interested in Iran. I guess this is a testament to how we've turned an adversity into an advantage. This COVID thing has brought us together in a much more immediate way. And hopefully with events like this, we can cut down on delay in terms of communicating latest ideas and latest work by ourselves and others. And so it's one of the aspirations I have in terms of what I'm talking about today is more to try to share with you some potentiality, some things, somewhat new ways in which we can begin to investigate an old question. And to me, the old question is the distribution of outcomes, whatever that outcome may be. It could be unidimensional: income, wages, health, education, wealth for that matter, or it could be a combination of those. Some of you know that I've worked on multidimensionality issues. And so you have the paradigm of a distributed outcome. And we want to essentially engage in two types of activities. One is to characterize that outcome, call it measurement. What is it? What is that distribution? How do you summarize the information in that distribution of outcomes? The other is to try a more ambitious goal of discovering mechanisms, what causes, as it were. It's the holy grail of econometrics or empirical work. Because if you discover causes, that's suggestive of policy. Maybe you can come up with remedies. If you don't like what is, the first step, measuring, then you might be able to influence it and change the circumstances. I would say that most of my work, including mostly today, is about measurement. I'm really already humbled by the challenge of trying to say what is the circumstance, how to characterize a distribution of outcomes rather than discover mechanism. But with this particular or peculiar topic of intergenerational mobility, it's kind of inevitable that one addresses mechanism. because it's the relationship between outcomes for two generations, parents and offsprings. So there is an idea of some interrelatedness between them. And the priors are that the stronger is that relationship, the less mobility there is, less intergenerational mobility. So if outcome for offsprings is predictable, the movements that you observe in one generation to the next are very predictable. That's suggestive of immobility, that things are predetermined. There is a fairly structured literature with Romer and others about opportunity circumstances, a division of the causes of outcomes into things that are due to effort, and those things that are due to circumstances that one cannot do anything about, parental characteristics, for instance. I'm not dealing with that today, though people like Djavad himself are very aware that's a fairly well-developed literature in terms of trying to understand this mechanism of movement from one generation outcome to another. Let me, if I may, share a screen, and feel free to interrupt. I'm perfectly okay with that. Let's see if I can. I was hoping to turn this into a full screen.
Control N.
I did that. Somehow it didn't respond. I guess it's because I'm sharing it. But I have another little trick in here that might work. Yeah, here we are. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, all right. Later we'll have the same challenge as I would try to navigate out of this document into one that has some empirical results. I'm hoping to stay below 1 hour. First, a little bit about motivation of what aspects of mobility, what is mobility, and what aspects of it I'm concerned with here. And then a fair amount of criticism of what is in the literature, not unexpected. I'm typically very critical of summarizing or summary methods, and regression methods or summarization methods. And then having criticized the ongoing research, the idea is what else can one do? And there I have some sort of new technology about how to do things that might be a little bit less familiar. And with your help, we'll try to resolve any questions about what those new techniques mean and what they depend on. And yes, Djavad is right, entropy will show its ugly head at some point in a very prominent way. So first of all, many of you are familiar with inequality. This is the outcome distribution. And one way of summarizing it is how unequal it is, how different that distribution is from uniform distribution, where everyone gets the same thing. So I'm already thinking about contrasting two distribution of outcomes. One is the distribution of income, wealth, or whatever. The other is the uniform distribution. That distance can be characterized in many ways. The way we do it is to first index each distribution. How do we index distributions? By summary statistics, mean, median, inequality measures like Gini, entropy, tiles. And then we compare those summary measures. So we don't actually compare the two distributions, we compare their summarizations. Then there is this notion that, okay, so what if people are unequal? People spend different effort, they're at different stages of their lives. Like, so you probably don't mind a physician at 65 earning more than a young person just finishing high school. So inequality at any given point in time is a little bit of a vacuous concept. So we want to graduate from that and maybe talk about not only lifetime incomes of people, hard to measure, data challenges begin to show themselves, but what is the direction? What is the characteristics of the movement in this? And that's where notion of mobility comes into play. First, maybe we should say a few words about what I call cross-sectional mobility. So you have a population, like current population in Iran is income, is a distribution. We want to see how that evolves. How is that group evolving over time, for instance? That's cross-sectional mobility. It's the same generation. We want to see what's happening to it. Already the question of what is good about movement, what is good about mobility, how do we characterize what is good about that is a challenge. I'll talk a little bit about that. We could think of movement as an opportunity to move up, to be better, as something that is good. And later we talk about how do you actually characterize that, how do you measure that. We could think in terms of at least intergenerational, we could think of predictability. Is what's going to happen in the next state, next generation, totally predictable or rough, or mostly predictable from the current state. That applies to both cross-sectional mobility and intergenerational mobility. Then mobility has two distinct components not being treated at all right now in the literature, even in the best journals. Movements have two components. One is growth. Imagine doubling everyone's income between two states. That's a growth component. The inequality within it hasn't changed. The other component is exchange. People's positions in the distribution of outcomes change, inequality changes. And those two are very different animals. This issue of ranks versus levels has fundamental consequences in terms of what implicit value judgments you take into account. Do you care about just ranks, relative positions, or do you care about the actual levels? Levels allow us to think of intensity of outcomes, intensity of differences. If there's $1,000 difference between people's income, they're ranked, one is above the other. And if there's $1 million, there's still one is ranked above the other, but we don't care about how much, the intensity. So oftentimes when statistical measures are adopted and regressions are run, people pay insufficient attention to implications of what kinds of welfare functions, what kinds of things they care about in terms of outcomes. And I'll have occasion to come back to this in the context of these IIE regressions. I won't dwell because of time on this business of opportunities and effort versus circumstances. That's a nicely developed literature. The Djavad has contributed quite a lot. I was not aware of some of it. I have become much more aware in the last bit of time, especially with MENA countries, and including Iran. Then I have this notion that is not original with me, but as usual, I'm so poorly read, I thought it was to begin with. And so it's mutuality of benefits. Think of two generations. Mobility literature currently is really almost totally focused on outcome for the offsprings. And the condition of the parents is just that, conditioning, given that what's happening to what will happen or what happens to the current generation. I think of it as more of a mutuality of benefits, especially in some cultures. The young continue to participate in activities of the household, parental household. Either they help with their care, their health, maybe they keep running the business, the land, and so on. And so this idea of this total separation or one-sidedness, asymmetry of going from parents to offsprings is probably overdone. I like to think of the joint distribution of outcomes in this situation. Joint distribution of outcomes, you choose the outcome. Let's take income, which is what I will be using in my empirical demonstrations. So it's the income of the parents and their children. And so there are, in a way, three components to this joint distribution. Is a useful way of thinking about it. One is the marginal distributions, distribution of income for children, distribution of income for parents. And then there's this dependence structure. It's generally not appreciated unless there is dependence between variables. Multidimensionality itself is not very meaningful. We can just as well talk about these marginals separately. So we call this a sort of a dynastic view, considering two or more generations at the same time. I will skip over re-emphasizing growth versus exchange components, but I will talk about this business of what happens as we go from one generation to another. So you think of having a distribution of income for parents. There is a mechanism by which they influence the outcome for children. And then there is a distribution of outcome for offsprings. And that distribution needs to be characterized, as well as the initial distribution. So was a fairly equal distribution of incomes among parents ended up becoming a less equal distribution for children, or more equal. From a welfare theoretic point of view, that matters, as well as the thing that is emphasized in intergenerational mobility, this conditional distribution of offspring income given the parents' income. That's, by the way, the basis of the workhorse, the regressions, is just that conditional distribution in its mean. What I'm suggesting is that there is a lot more going on. Where they were, parents, state, how they're getting to the next stage, next generation, and what is the status of the next generation. These are all welfare theoretic issues, and we have to consider things like vertical evaluation of states, horizontal equality, and the process. Every time that you would characterize a distribution, and a joint distribution for that matter, with a measure, with an index, you have aggregated. You have committed a subjective aggregation of all the components of a distribution. This is something that I've had passion about and dwelled on quite a lot in everything I do. And oftentimes when you confront people with the implied value judgments in the aggregations that they've committed, they tend to actually question it, say, I really don't believe that. You say, well, but if you use correlation, that is what you're doing. If you use the mean, this is what you're doing, and so on and so on. So the idea is to have some reference back to a well-developed literature on inequality and the axioms for what would constitute a good inequality measure, and extend that to the idea of what might be a good measure of mobility, either cross-sectional or intergenerational. As you might imagine, when you go to the joint outcome for two generations, it becomes more of an arrows problem. There will never be a single underlying welfare function that would be satisfied and agreed upon by everyone. Therefore, there will never be a single index that either would be agreed upon or that can pick up all the things that you would like a measure of mobility to pick up, okay? And I'll, again, if I have an opportunity, I'll discuss some measures that try to satisfy as many ideal properties of a mobility measure as possible, but in a very fleeting fashion. All right, then if you cannot, I'll sort of finish up the technical part of the talk, saying if you cannot agree on a single measure, a Gini or tile, or this measure of mobility or that measure of mobility, can you actually uniformly compare entire distributions, rank distributions? Interestingly, one can, there are methods for stochastic dominance and concordance rankings that allow you to do that, to at least examine whether the two outcomes, univariate or multivariable, can be ranked no matter what index you use, what utility function you use. And when you discover that, you've found something really fantastic. And sometimes it's empirically possible to do that, so one should not despair. This ends up, this business of uniform ranking, to involve tests for stochastic dominance or tests for concordance, but also they can be translated into tests for copulas, the Fréchet inequalities on copulas, the minimal copula and maximal copula, allow us to make that kind of uniform judgment about comparing the US with Iran or some other country in terms of what's happened to 2 or more generations in the last 50, 60 years. All right, just a little bit on distributions and a sort of a bunch of promises and suggestions about my younger friends in this audience, but exciting new possibilities. But I won't dwell on this. I will move on to the discussion of the workhorse of intergenerational mobility, which are these regressions. I want us to consider this dynastic distribution of incomes, let's say, of parents and children, okay? These can be conditioned. So one could write this joint distribution as distribution of children's income given parent plus other characteristics. These characteristics could be the children's characteristics and the parents' characteristics, and they can be separable or similar. And this decomposition is beginning to really quite revolutionize what we can do. We can estimate these distributions non-parametrically and make statements about both the conditional distribution, which is the mechanism, the process of going from one outcome to another, but also try to do counterfactual analysis about what could possibly be, what could happen if the distribution of the x's were the distribution of counterfactual groups. I do this with Wong, not at all original with me, where we look at the distribution of incomes for women and decompose it into what would be the distribution were they to receive the returns, the rewards for their own characteristics, men's rewards, or keep their rewards but have the characteristics of men. You can actually play that kind of counterfactual. And the thing is, whatever measure of these indices, mobility, inequality, and so on, are functionals of this joint distribution. There's no two ways about it. And therefore, one could compare whatever measure you like between two sets of situations. Here, I focused on defining one thing. This F is the joint distribution of incomes for the two generations. G is the counterfactual when they might be independent. This independent outcome, distribution of outcomes, plays a fairly unique role here. It's the ultimate mobility, it's maximal mobility, where the outcome for offspring has nothing to do with the parents. Especially this is so when we have control for x's, given those controls. I want to go back here and share with my friends a couple of things. This joint distribution requires estimation of the conditional distribution, the first F. And when I move my cursor, do you see it? Is it? Okay, super. But this first conditional distribution is beginning to see some revolutionary possibilities in the econometrics literature. Wong and I, and in the recent JPE, and followed Furpo and others, what we do is to estimate all the quantiles of this conditional distribution and then invert. So there's thousands of quantile regressions, and when you invert them, you get the joint distribution. So that's one method. And then we play the counterfactual analysis. The newer method I'm rather excited about is by Chernozhukov and others. It's an old idea of, I think, Frank Villa. These distribution regressions are easier to run and lead to inference theory, asymptotic distribution theory, that's the standard, whereas with quantiles, distribution theory is not the standard. What is distribution regression? So imagine you have 500 data points on the support of the values of, say, income. Every data point is a partition of your sample. Some of your observations are below that, they get a score of 1. Some of your observations are above that point, they get a score of 0. You can see that you're doing a probit logit. You now have a characterization of every point in your sample as a partition that allows you to run a probit or logit regression to estimate that conditional probability at that point. So you run zillions of probit logit. At the end of the day, you actually have the conditional distribution. They're easy to do, tedious, but easy to do. The asymptotic distribution theory for it is a standard. All the tests are standard. I would recommend to those of you who are not familiar with that, to go to, say, Chernozhukov or Fernandez-Val at Boston University. The code is there, all the theory, some lecture notes on it. Highly recommend it. We try to get these conditional distributions estimated in this fashion is quite an achievement, and I think quite useful for rigorous work. All right, that's parenthetical. The promise of all of this is that I can compute changes in any index, mobility, inequality, whatever, as functionals of these distributions, and all the counterfactual games that I can play in terms of decompositions by characteristics, by gender, by race, and by location and things like that. I want to get to the workhorse of how intergenerational mobility literature is done. So let's get a little bit formal. Imagine observing outcome of interest at point t+1 in time. These are offspring outcome. And ZIT is a bunch of characteristics, experiences, efforts, or whatever of the prior generation, ZITs. And this mechanism is what we are after, this relationship, this form of dependence. And we could try to characterize this dependence by conditional probabilities, transition matrices, as some might call them, or by regressions of this kind, right? So logarithm of the children's outcome income is a function of logarithm of parental income, plus covariates that you control for, obviously, as in all regressions. I'm avoiding abstracting from these covariates to make sure that I make my points. Now, there are two ways that people are running these regressions. One is the log in levels. The other is just levels, okay? And the other one is in terms of ranks. So you need paired observations. This makes it really hard to find sources of data. PSID is one. Luxembourg data offers this opportunity. You have to find parental incomes and children's incomes such that all the other characteristics you want to control were observed. So these guys have to stay in the panel, as it were, for a long time. And in addition, you have this issue that I alluded to. What income, what output, what outcome at which point in time? Imagine looking at a father's income in 1967 in PSID, Michigan panel. Why would that income alone be important, right? Why not the 20 years of income of the father, so that we have some idea of permanent income? And the same thing for the child. When you talk about outcome, it's better measured not at one point in time because it's subject to life cycle changes, noise, all sorts of things. That really puts quite a burden on the type of data you need. You need to have followed the same parents and child pairs over a number of years. And then, of course, there's a question of what is permanent income. I did some work on this. I didn't like, again, the workhorse of permanent income is the average of income over a number of years. My objection to that kind of averaging is that averages implied infinite substitution, intertemporal substitution for income. And I don't believe income at age 70, at $1 at age 70 has the same value as age 21. And that's what you get by averages. So I came up with these aggregators that allowed finite substitutability, and we use some of that in our empirical work. Some of you may have familiarity with the cross-sectional mobility work that Shahrukh did, which I extended with a Persian friend of mine, Zan Vakili, where we use these other permanent income aggregators. We used entropy, Djavad, to come up with the ideal aggregators of annual incomes, as it were. So what are the issues with these regressions? The regressions are dominated. If you open QJE, JPE, all the top 5 journals and others, it's these regressions that dominate. When you read about Chetty's work, these regressions are being run in terms of race, zip codes, and cities and counties and so on. And the idea is that people think by taking these logs, they come close to linearity. We find no such evidence of linearity whatsoever. There is massive nonlinearity in this relationship, depending on subgroups that you look at, and that's already is a problem. So looking at these coefficients, betas. So what is this beta, first of all? If this beta is a partial correlation coefficient, right? It's a regression. This beta, the larger it is, the more closely related, one, they argue, are the incomes of the two generations. Therefore, the larger the beta, the less mobility. Beta is a measure of immobility, okay? Whatever you do, whether you do ranks or logs or otherwise. I have a lot of issues. Let me play games with this a little bit. I'm going to caricaturize, exaggerate, if you like, to make my point. Think of, can you all see my whiteboard? All right. So I have a classic regression, and we stay with bivariate regression. And we can write this OLS estimator as the correlation between Y and X, variant, standard error of Y, standard error of X. So sort of an unusual way of writing OLS estimator to make my point. I hope you're familiar with this formula. It's used, this particular way of writing it is used, for instance, to compare OLS with IV estimators and to bring out the role of weak instruments. So correlation between Y and X. What's the difference between correlation and covariance? Correlation is a scaling variant. So if I multiply incomes of children by 2, I still get the same correlation. If I do the same thing to X or some other multiple, I still get the same. Correlations are invariant to multiplications of constants. So it doesn't matter what outcomes parents and children had, I will still get the same correlation. And regression is about correlation, right? But it's a bit worse than that, at least for levels. If I now multiply, compare two dynasties, 2 countries, parent-child pairs. In one, I have the same parents and the same variation, okay, the same sigma x. In one of the outcomes for children, I have the same distribution, but every income has been multiplied by 2. Right? So in one of the children's distributions, everyone earns twice as the other dynasty. What happens to beta hat? I get twice the beta hat. So the same parents in a situation where the children have the same distribution, that each person has twice as much, I conclude that there is less mobility because my beta hat is twice of the original dynasty. I could play the same game with sigma x. This lack of invariance to scale is an issue. Logs take care of that. Log of ranks take care of that. But what do I mean by taking care of that? Supposing I use logs of these variables, then beta hats become invariant to scales. Now, you might think that's statistically a good thing. It is, but from a welfare theoretic point of view, it's not a good thing because it says I don't care about levels at all, right? So I can have children of the same parents be multiple times as well off, or vice versa. I get the same idea of intergenerational mobility. I find that problematic. This lack of response to scale, both good and bad, and some of it is shared by the alternative methodology I discussed for you for this talk. We have a fair amount of other work going on with Lei Wang and Stephen Durloff that try to do better than these measures. So that's one thing. The other is that regressions, intergenerational mobility, are about conditional means, right? The regression line is the mean of y given x. That's all that you're getting. You're abstracting from all the other good stuff that is happening in distribution. For instance, heteroscedasticity in these outcomes is massive by geography, by race, by gender, by zip code, all of that. And by focusing on the conditional mean, you're missing the entire distribution of y given x, which is a lot richer. And as usual, I have a preference for looking at the distributions and try to be very explicit about summarizing. Something about means and the more robust competitor to mean median. Let me talk about that a little bit. I want you to consider two circumstances. This is one distribution of outcomes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? The mean of this is 3, right? And the median is also 3. Compare this outcome with this. This latter outcome is not unlike income distribution in a lot of countries, including the US of A. These are groups, so these are representative numbers for groups. Here, the mean has gone to 5. The median is still 3, right? Mixture appreciation of what indexing, what regression running. Regression running is a summarization, is an aggregation. Well hidden one, but it is one. So think about this. As far as characterizing each distribution is concerned, 3 is not bad for the first distribution, right? But what about 5 characterizing this distribution? 5 is nobody's outcome, right? 5 is above most of this population, 1, 2, 3, 4, and is nowhere near 50. And so the mean, conditional mean regression really misses the whole thing. And so that's one problem. You might say, let's do more robust methods. Robust says median is 3, median is 3. So as far as robust the statistics are, again, summarizing by median is concerned, these two populations are equal. There's no difference between them. So what is nice about robustness turns into something not so nice about being insensitive. That's another name for robust, right? So you could go on. The other example I would give you is, let's say we have 0.9, 0.91, 0.92, 0.93. You get my point. There's still the ranking these two distributions give the same ranks to these members of the population, but there is clearly very little, almost decimal errors between the outcomes for these 5 groups compared to this situation, right? And yet, if you go with rank regressions and summaries of ranks, you don't care about the difference between this distribution or this. They're all the same. These 5 guys are ranked in the same fashion. So one has to be truly careful with summary measures, indices, inequalities, means, regression estimators, and so on and so on. Let me see if I can go back to my slide. Okay, all right. Successful transition, not always given with me. There are attempts to actually identify much more in much more detail the role of investments and conditioning variables at different stages of life. You know, the Heckman in particular is very concerned about early childhood investments. It turns out to be quite important. And some of the work that I cite in this paper, I'll be happy to share this paper soon. There is attempts made within the context of this regression to tell what is the value of father's income or family income at various points in the child's life. So we can actually play games like that when you, in the context of this parametric regression, you have the advantage of being able to actually say more about what that transition is. But with the blinkers of a regression put on, those things become possible. All right. If you don't mind, I will jump over this discussion of these decompositions, which doesn't play a role in what I'm doing. But again, to be helpful to my younger friends in the audience, this business of doing Oaxaca blinder decompositions, which are very popular at the mean, at the regression level, have now been extended to decompositions at the distribution level. This paper by Firpo, Lemieux, and Fortin, Handbook of Labor Economics, I think is a 2011, is a beautiful summary of what you can and cannot do with these distribution decompositions. I do some of it with Lei Wang in this recent JPE paper. So that's sort of the frontier of what one can do with distributions and decompositions to try to get a better handle on what's causing, what's the difference between different groups, and by education, by race, by gender. All right. Somewhat of a digression, a bit of a good news. I don't have results today to give you. We have results on these measures. Is a tradition of a literature, mostly in England, among English scholars, to try to write down axioms, conditions for a good measure of intergenerational or mobility or intergenerational mobility. And the principal component in these measures that satisfy a lot of things, what should they reflect if there is complete mobility? What if in the middle of mobility range, caring about intensity, caring about horizontal inequality, caring about vertical inequality, all of those tend to give a central place to this gamma, to this Gini correlation coefficient. It's the covariance, is the relationship between levels and ranks in the numerator for parents and child, divided by the same relationship between parents' level income and the parents' rank. This is almost like an OLS coefficient, right? It's that kind of thing, but it's between levels and ranks, and to some extent picks up both matters of vertical and horizontal movement. There's a beautiful discussion of this by Chetman and Yitzhaki, who's actually done a lot of work on Gini correlations and Gini regressions and so on. Even Mervyn King, the former governor of Bank of England, in his youth wrote axiomatic papers, like in the manner of Atkinson, Tony Atkinson, who always liked to say, declare your biases, welfare theoretic biases, with any measure that you use. And so there is a so-called Atkinson-Plotnick measure, asymmetric measure of mobility that is welfare theoretic based. And as you can see, it depends on that Gini correlation coefficient. And you can symmetrize it if you care about dynastic comparisons of groups, the view that I was advocating, that is the two generations, multiple generations, not just an asymmetric focus on what happens to the offsprings. How you symmetrize this and where you get those weights, or where the devil is, the details. And you can actually use Gini weights to try to symmetrize and try to have desirable, Lorentz curve desirable measures of mobility. And it's very easy to compute these things. So for instance, this IGM, intergenerational mobility measure, that I have in my slide, can be estimated simply by sample averages, not difficult at all. We've done some of this, but at the end of the day, the point is that there will never, this is an Arrovian situation, there will never be a single measure that would be agreed upon by everyone, because each one of them is good with respect to certain welfare considerations, not so good with respect to certain other considerations. Some of them have issues in terms of the limit performance. Do they truly represent limits of mobility properly or not? And some do better than others in that regard. I'm just sharing with you that there is light at the end of the tunnel. There are better measures than regressions, as it were, even if you want to commit to indexing, summarizing the situation with intergenerational mobility. If you don't agree, if you think it's hopeless to find a measure that everyone would agree to, can you do uniform ranking of distributions? And the answer is yes. We have both the theory for doing that and the statistical tools and the algorithms, the code. I want you to look at this because I have a little bit of results on this later on. This business of concordance is of some significance. Let me translate for those of you who are not in this literature. Imagine low parent incomes and low children incomes, low and low, and high parent incomes and high children's incomes, right? If there is a great deal of correlation between them, concordance, you have evidence of lack of mobility, right? So if these high and high move together, low and low move together, there is a way of testing if you have that in two different states or for different countries by just comparing the CDFs of the two states, okay? And in the case of just two, parent and child, two generations, I don't need these survival inequalities. It's enough to just test over the entire support of the outcomes for the two groups, just to see if one CDF falls below the other. And I have developed tests for this kind of thing with Oliver Linton and Yun-Jae Wong. There are other tests that have code and are implementable very easily. This would be something that I would do on the side whenever I look at inequality or mobility, to see if I have rankings that don't depend on a particular measure. And if I do, I might use one of those measures to be able to monitor if things are improving or report by how much do I have more mobility here or more inequality there. I know some of you may not be familiar with copulas. And I need to sort of bring us all on the same plane because of what I'm going to do as a competitor to Copulas. This holy grail about characterizing the relationship between the joint distribution of variables and their marginals. What's the connectivity? What is the joint? It goes back a long time. And the best it seems like we've been able to do historically is to come up with this Scalar's theorem. This Scalar's theorem says that there is if you translate all your variables by the probability transform, so every variable turns into its rank, its order, using its CDF, cumulative distribution function. Then the joint distribution of these CDFs is actually equal to the CDF, the original joint distribution. And the nice thing about this is that it goes both ways. You can actually derive the copula as the original CDF with the inversions of these uniform marginals. It makes it very easy to draw from uniform distributions, to simulate and things of that kind. And now you have a parametric way of describing what is the jointness. People use copulas to describe dependence in a lot of circumstances. In the publications of Chetty and other intergenerational mobility researchers, they drop this word copula, but they've never used it, I was told. What it is the following. If you use regression in terms of levels of income, you're using Pearson's correlation function. We all know about that. And if the joint distribution were normal, that's all you would need to know. It's a sufficient statistic. If you use the rank-rank regression, you're using Spearman's rank correlation, okay? And Spearman's rank correlation totally characterizes a copula if the joint density is Gaussian, is normal, and the copula is normal. Unless those are the case, then those correlations, rank or levels, really are misspecifications of the underlying distribution. And I'll show you results for the PSID. There is no evidence of anything near normality for either the marginals or the joint distributions. So these regressions and or reporting Kendall's tau or Spearman's rank correlation, Pearson's correlation, are based on fully misspecified underlying distributions. One has to do better, and it's possible to do. So,
Mr. John, can you wrap it up in 10 minutes?
Yes.
Great.
I will try. So here is where I'm getting close to what I want to propose and what my numbers are about. So the scalar's relationship was in terms of CDFs, cumulative distribution functions. If I take derivatives, I have the joint PDF of my generations here, just two, right? Y1 and Y2. Then it is what's known as the copula density plus the product of the marginals. This density, copula density, is that ephemeral jointness, is everything, is a sufficient statistic for what is the relationship between these variables. And I was thinking, can I do better than this? Because these copulas are typically chosen to be parametric. And I had one of these aha moments. In fact, I had a da moment. It's sort of embarrassing. I've been working with replacement for this C for about 30 years and didn't quite know it. So in order to show you what that is, I want you to see this trivial statement, right? It says the joint distribution is equal to this ratio times the product of the marginals. This ratio, of course, is the joint divided by the counterfactual total mobility, right? Product of the marginals. This ratio is everything in the statistics. It's sort of the likelihood ratio, but it's even more than everything in information theory. Imagine if you took log of this, it's invariant to monotonic transformation, so log is okay. If I took expected value of this, that's just Kullback-Leibler measure of distance, divergence between these two distributions. And I've got multiple papers using this measure to test for symmetry and reversibility and dependence and predictability and all kinds of things. And it's a very familiar measure. I talk about it quite a lot in this survey I have in ER in 1993, but there are other sources. Everyone knows about Kullback-Leibler. They're using it in all kinds of situations. But my point is, I have a sufficient statistic. Hashem used this ratio, Esfandiar, when he extended test for hypothesis for non-nested models. David Cox's work was not in regression. Hashem did this in some very influential work, was to do with this ratio, and log of this ratio is a log of likelihood ratio. So it's a well-known thing, and it amazes me that had not been noticed. So what I have in terms of numbers is I look at this ratio and I want to characterize this distance. Expected value of log of this, expected value of logarithm of this is Shannon entropy of the numerator minus Shannon entropy of the denominator. That's what the Kullback-Leibler is. So just to emphasize, I won't switch my page. Minus expected value of a density is Shannon's entropy. It's that simple. Expected value of log of a density is Shannon's entropy. The thing is, that has value attached to it. It's actually connected to value functions about how you measure the distance between two distributions. How do you treat every point in that? How do you treat individuals, young, old, race, and so on? So you can see that statistical measurement always has underlying decision theoretic consequences. So what I do is to do both KL, Kullback-Leibler, which is what this guy is. That's just expected value of log of that ratio. This is all I need, according to KL, to learn about mobility. It combines everything about the marginals, combines everything about the conditional distribution, and incidentally, it cannot miss anything that the regression would pick up, but it will pick up all the nonlinearities. It's like a characteristic function. Is expected value of a density, log of a density, so it contains all higher order moments, differences between two distributions. Nonlinearity is now the hot thing. Everyone is discovering in an empirical way why this mobility or immobility measure is different for different groups. The reason they're finding that is that it's different at different parts of the distribution. This entropic measure picks it all up. The work I did with Clive Granger, Racine, focused on what's a lot of good things about KL, except one thing is not metric. So we wrote a bunch of axioms about what would be a good metric, distance between any two distributions. And we came up with this S-rho function. And initially it was called Granger-Maasoumi measure, reflecting our ignorance that we didn't know about Hellinger. This is just a normalized Hellinger measure. It's the only metric measure because it's both symmetric, where you can symmetrize KL, that's not an issue, but it's the only measure of distance between two distributions that satisfies the triangularity condition. So I can actually compare different groups' mobility. I cannot do that with KL because it fails to satisfy the triangular inequality. It's something that I'm passionate about, to use S-rho rather than KL. It turns out that whatever you find with S-rho, KL will give you larger values of it because the welfare function that attaches to KL puts more weight on what's happening to the lower income than higher income. That's really the implied welfare differences between them. The values, very small S-rho means you have a lot of mobility, right? Independence case is very close to your actual joint distribution, and the maximum is normalized. The maximum value 1 is where you have perfect immobility, and everything else in between. I don't know if I have time to show you a little bit of results, maybe. So let's see.
Yeah, 5 minutes would be good.
Just 5 minutes, right? So Control L. All right, so we've computed those KL and SRO measures, but we first looked non-parametrically at these distributions, joint distributions. And these contours tell you a story of how bad mobility is in a way. The more directed, the more elliptical they are, the worse it is, right? And so we do this, including without the SEO, this survey of economic opportunity, adding many more poor observations to DPSID than otherwise. It tends to reinforce the findings when you do that, so I won't dwell on it. But this is comparison of the actual non-parametric copula that we find compared to normal. And the normal that is reflected underlies the regressions, underestimates immobility for the poor, slightly overestimates mobility for the rich, if you like. So normality is totally rejected at very high significance level for almost every group, every region. We have results here for regions of the US, 4 of them. And then we have results for cohorts, parents who were born before 1954, 54, 61, and so on. There was some improvement, as you all know, even from inequality literature, in the 60s, and then there is a reversion back to what used to be the case. So things were showing a little bit of mobility. These are all significant, by the way. We know the distribution theory, so bootstrap methods are used to test for significance of the differences in these circumstances. I will finish with maybe this guy, right? What you find is this, so it's what do I get out of my methods? First of all, I don't miss out anything. So if in fact the regression summarize well, I'm not going to miss it. That's the beauty of these distribution-based methods. Secondly, I find that I pick up the influence of higher order moments that contribute to immobility without fail. The differences between races, between regions that will be picked up by regressions to some extent are much, much bigger, multiple times bigger when you use these entropic methods, when you consider all the differences, all levels, all parts of the distribution. So the picture of mobility or immobility that arises is that immobility, according to PSID, is a lot worse among the poor than regressions would suggest. And it's getting worse. And it's the affluence grip or trap is definitely there, but is not as serious and not in all regions. In particular for others, not white, black, it's very interesting that the very affluent among them are doing very well. As sort of an exceptional group. Your impressions about the South being worst off are confirmed and reinforced by these entropy methods versus the regressions. All of our results replicate the regression numbers, so we are confident that we haven't made any serious mistakes. This is just one paper. There are 3 or 4 other papers that attack various other aspects with these new methodologies, and I'll be delighted in due course to share these papers with you.
Thank you very much, Issy. That was a fascinating talk, a little over my head since I didn't go to LSE. You know, I was prevented from going to LSE by Queen Mary. It's a little bit of anecdote there. After we got our grades, we went to LSE and said, can we enroll here? Because they said, yeah, the grades are fine, but Queen Mary has to sign off and set you free. And we went back to Queen Mary and said, no, you've already committed. So it's a very strange system there. I wasn't aware of that.
You were too good to let go. That's the true story.
Thank you. That's very kind. But in the end, that cost me a lot because I learned econometrics as a bunch of matrices and drawing a line between all the points. And I'm trying to go back to learn the distributions, and I can see how important it is to look at the distributions. Before we go to the questions, I don't see any questions actually on Q&A. If you want to raise your hands, please do, and Kamiar can promote you. But before that, I wanted to just say how important it is for IIEA to be encouraging work on mobility, because, you know, as Hashim Pesaran's early work in the 1970s showed, inequality was very high in Iran, and he was the first to calculate the Gini index. And after that, the focus has been on cross-section inequality. You know, you type Gini in Persian or in English, Iran, you get a lot of hits. There's so much discussion of that. But in fact, what is hidden behind that is mobility. And that's some of the work I did that you are kind to mention. We can only look at education because income mobility, we don't have data for, but we should, because that's also very important. And we found out that in Iran, inequality of opportunity is very high in education, that if you are a child of with a disadvantaged background, you're very unlikely to score high enough in these international exams to be able to get into a good college, good university. So the discussion of Gini, in a way, hides all the trouble that the country has with lack of mobility. In some sense, there's too much confidence about we're a revolution country, and revolutions are by definition create a lot of mobility. But that confidence is false, because now we're suffering, I think, the consequence of not having indicators of that lack of mobility. So I hope the young people who can learn this stuff and apply it, maybe even encourage new data to be created to allow the intergenerational mobility. We do have this data, for example, for Egypt, because they do a survey every 6 years where they have the parental background and they follow the children, but we don't have anything like that for Iran. Okay, with that said, I would like to invite Nadere, who had a question, to ask, and then I have Hamid Muqtadi has raised his hand. Kamiar Jun, can you?
Nadere is just joining.
Okay, thank you.
Nadere Jun, you are live.
Yes, yes. Can you see me? Sorry, thank you. Thank you very much for this very, very rich, Professor Maasoumi, for this incredibly rich presentation. I join Djavad to say that certainly a large part of it was way above my head. But I feel as if, you know, okay, I am somewhat versed in this field. It's sort of like knowing how to paint, and then you go to a museum, you can understand the masterpiece that is in front of you, and certainly the master who has painted it. And I feel the same way, that, you know, this was way above a masterpiece. And I'm delighted to have joined here, and I very much congratulate you. You mentioned a couple of times the word gender. You know, I worked for 35 years at the World Bank, and of course worked on many different fields. And in the last half of my work at the World Bank, my tenure at the World Bank, I also spent quite a bit of time on gender, the gender dimension, and this is how I got to know Djavad and many of the other wonderful Iranians who work on Iranian economic issues. And in the last 8 years, I've also continued to work on gender issues, among other things, not just on gender issues. And of course, every time I hear the word gender, of course, you know, there is an energy and adrenaline that runs through my body. And you mentioned the word gender, and the fact that through this model, one could actually do some analysis or find some results. I have actually three questions actually to put it well. You mentioned parental income. Is there a difference if this parental income, or at least the family income, comes from one source or from two sources, from mother and father. The reason I'm saying that is because there's a lot of, at least I have come across quite a bit of literature in the sense of that mother's income is very much used for investments in capital, in the capital, human capital of the children, and that it has very much intergenerational impact. So I wanted to see whether in the models that you have, whether that can be distinguished and whether the impact can be measured. And the second point that I have, the second question I have is that whether the children's mobility could be also measured depending on their gender, because as we all know, in any family, be it one income or two income families, it is likely that the boy child gets more of an investment in terms of education, any kind of support than the girl child. So therefore, the intergenerational mobility of a girl child from the very same family could be very different than the intergenerational mobility of the boy child. So whether, again, this could be it could be disaggregated to such level. And my third question is that I am not very familiar, or at least I haven't used all of these great techniques that you suggested. In my milieu and in my world, we very much, at the most, we use probit and logit models. And whether this could be somehow, that was the kind of the easiest thing to do, or at least the most sophisticated we could do with the data that we had, if that was even possible. And if these two disaggregations would be possible, could be made possible within these models that are so widely used. I don't know whether I have maybe veered off the road, but I would very much appreciate your insights, and thank you very much for this very rich presentation. And I look forward to watching your presentation in order to really understand to fully understand your rich, rich work. Thank you so much.
I appreciate Dr. Shamlu. A series of very, very important questions. I share your concern about the gender differences. The paper I briefly cited with Lei Wong in the JPE, it is entirely focused on gender differences and using these techniques that I just mentioned. But in terms of not mobility, the state of the wages outcomes, and the situation is not only confirmed in terms of when we decompose by structural market returns to characteristics versus the characteristics themselves, gender. There is, in fact, now rigorous evidence at the distribution level that there is a discriminatory outcome for females. It's not quite the average 73 cents versus $1. It's much more complicated than that. The specific situation with intergenerational mobility is rather disappointing in terms of data. So we have already used family income instead of just one parent or head of household, as it were, because quite a few families in the PSID are female-headed households. The trouble we have is that out of tens of thousands of individual observations, you end up with, in some cases, as few as 800 pairs. And so because we
even
need
in the United States?
This is the Michigan panel study of income dynamics. It's quite disappointing. There are other sources. I've begun to play games with CPS, which is much larger data set, but that's not a panel. It's that I have tricks for trying to invent missing waves of data and attributing them to people, again, using entropy methods. It's rather aspirational, courageous to do that. Some European countries, Northern European countries in particular, have very rich data and goes back a long time. And there is some work based on the regressions, not the methodology that I'm proposing, that tries to bring out the role of gender differences in terms of background, circumstances, but in particular, in terms of the outcome for the offspring generation. And so far as even the underestimated view of things in terms of regressions is that there are gender differences. No doubts about it. The situation you mentioned about family income is very subtle. When you have both parents earn income and are employed, it suddenly becomes even more so than normal, a multidimensional thing. What kinds of families have both parents employed, gainfully employed, tend to have also higher education, better health outcomes, and so on. So I would say that certainly these are questions that pertain as part of the aspiration with those decompositions I mentioned. The data challenges are enormous. Sometimes we get into cells that are so small, 13 people in terms of, say, other races or people with at certain quantiles. Again, because we're not summarizing, lack of data in certain parts of the distribution are even more consequential for us. And so it's challenging. And it reminds me of early 30s and 40s with Keynes trying to do macro and suddenly discovering we need income accounts and national accounts, and people beginning to ask the right questions when they collected panel data and surveys. And that some of this will hopefully lead to that and relate also to Djavad's question. I've used the Iranian panel for multidimensional analysis, and we used the Mahmoudi to do this decomposition of poverty in terms of gross and exchange components, but it did not, it wasn't as demanding as this intergenerational, needing multiple years of observations on each of the two groups and making sure they're the ones that have all the other variables measured as well and participating all through. So it's data-wise, it's rather humbling.
Thank you, Esias. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In the interest of time, since that's part of my job here, I will let you know that Nadare is a board member. She gets to ask 3 questions. Everybody else is limited to 1 question. And please make your question short. The answers hopefully short so we can get to the bulk of stuff before too long. I guess Hamid Mortadi, Dr. Mortadi is now asking a question.
Yeah, it's coming next, and then Ramin has a question as well.
Okay, very good. There are a couple of questions also on the chat room that I can raise later on.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yes, yes, okay? Go ahead.
Dr. Maasoumi, thank you so much for this wonderful, thoughtful, deep, profound, both theoretically, analytically, and socially significant work. This is wonderful, we really, and I certainly echo Nadare's comments regarding the masterful work that you've done. A couple of quick questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to try to make them really short. Number one, it's wonderful to see that the usefulness of callback-liable functions now, comparing distance of distributions now finds its way to mobility literature. So this is wonderful. And I really look forward to reading the family of papers that you've mentioned. And certainly, as Dr. says, rewatching this, because I think you've really touched upon what some of us might consider really a gold mine here in terms of the way of rethinking this. The other question I had is with one of my former students, who's now professor at the University of Indiana. We did some work where we looked at the IRS data historically from 1946 to 1972, 1946 to 2017. And we looked at the IRS data, developed the inequality measures, tile, and so on. And what we found is that when you look at the household instead of the individual wage earners, that the famous Golden Margot compression, great compression, gets inverted. We no longer have great income. In fact, from World War II on, we do have an increase in inequality. And the difference, of course, is that male wage earners in their data, full-time wage earners and so on, versus households and so on. So what I'm, I guess, wondering is whether the fact that we're moving from individual to household allows us to think about issues of mobility over the course of the 1950s that may have been missed if you know, for instance, the role of women entering to the labor force and what happens to their children and so on. So I'm wondering if there are ways of thinking about mobility that allows us to understand why moving from individual to household data really changes the structure of the classical understanding of grade compression so much, so radically. So you know, I know this is a very broad question, but so I will leave it at that. And again, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation.
I appreciate your kind comments and the question. I don't want to pretend that I have a good command of all of the empirical issues or many of them. This first, in terms of this hiatus of changing inequality or mobility, there is sort of a phenomenon of pre-Reagan 5 to 10 years of improvement. Whatever one looks at, I've looked at cross-sectional mobility where you add up aggregate income, families, individuals over many years. It doesn't go away. There was something good happening, as it were, in terms of inequality reduction. And we now see a little bit of that in the cohort results in terms of slightly more mobility with our data in that same period, but it's gone back. It's reverted back to what it was before the great anti-poverty policies, Johnson era policies, and so on. I think my preference would be to look at family circumstances rather than parent, father, or mom. I think the idea is to pick up what circumstances are influential in the outcome for offsprings. And clearly, all the resources that are made available, both financial and otherwise, by both parents in a household, maybe even extended family. In some cultures, that matters a lot more than others. If one had data, my guess is that one would find that it, first of all, is the family income and family circumstances that are influential. Secondly, that cohesive, better off families rather than single-headed households are much more conducive to higher mobility. The disappointing thing in terms of mobility is levels of income, family or individual, seem to be to provide a grip, the poverty trap. So even if for your poor families, even when you add up all of the families, still doesn't seem to be conducive to mobility. Children of poor households tend to have poor outcomes. That's the disappointing. It's quite a grip. It's quite a trap. And likewise, for richer families, I think it's less important, certainly in terms of financial resources. But again, people call it an affluence trap. I call it an affluence grip. Money begets money, and the rich outcomes tend to be highly correlated at that level as well. I'm guessing that even if one had richer data, that picture overall will not change very much.
Thank you.
Next question is from Rami Nasihi.
He's coming up now. Robin, you're live, I think.
Hello, hi. Fascinating talk. I'm not an econometrician, but I understand you develop tools, you build the microscopes, and others use it. So I'm very curious about the impact of your work in the policy world. Has there been a demand for it, and if yes, from which institutions? Thank you.
Sure. So in the US, somewhat more familiar with the various sources of demand to try to pin down the mechanism by which we have these poverty traps, these sort of poverty sets. In terms of the granting bodies, a much more generous, much more focused granting of research on this rather than inequality. At least two very major groups, Chetty's group at Harvard and Saya's somewhat Piketty-related group at Berkeley, are rather massive groups. They're quite teams that I'm very jealous of. I have to hire mercenaries at Chicago and everywhere else to be sort of a small team. They are advisors to people who are running presidential elections in terms of what to do to break even the current picture of immobility in terms of minimum wages, in terms of payment of fixed amounts to all households irrespective of means. All of them are various ways of attacking this lack of mobility. So surprisingly, pleasantly, the intercourse between this research and policy decisions and policy positions has been pretty active, pretty satisfying. Senator Warner has adopted quite a few of suggestions by Sayers and Piketty. Senator Sanders adopted quite a few of these same policies. I think the tone of discussion about inequality has changed. I'll just share with you my own thinking. I used to be a lot more concerned about inequality and poverty separately and mobility separately. Now I think it's all about movement up. And it doesn't matter, the whole distribution matters only in the sense that you need to know the relationship between different parts of it. But it's really the ability to move out of poverty. That is the focus, and a lot of policy is being responsive to the findings so far. Chetty's results are proprietary data, IRS data, being somewhat reluctant to share. They don't contradict what we find. To answer, I think, one of the questions in the chat, the main message is that what we found through these nominal regression summaries is not wrong, it's just an understatement. Things are a lot worse, non-linearly slow, and the problem is much more severe than we thought in places where we thought they're severe. So that's my sort of limited answer to the interconnectivity with policy decisions.
Good, thank you,
Thank you, Rami.
I'm going to ask one question myself, and then maybe I summarize a few other questions that's on the chat room. Has anyone looked at Chetty's work, which I understand is basically saying zip codes define you? Is that correct? Has anyone looked at that to say that if you change the technique of estimation, like using yours, that you get a different answer, and sort of qualify some of that result in statistics, econometrics wise?
So Leah and I have tried. We've contacted him and co-authors to get the data, to put it in our conditioning set. Recall that joint distribution, dynastic distribution, as it were, that I wrote down. It has a conditional part that can have any covariates to control. That includes zip codes. And we can play all manner of counterfactuals with that. The trouble is we haven't gotten our hands on the data, but based on these results on PSID, which he has also used, my prediction would be that we might reconfirm what they found, that would reinforce what they found. The problem is more severe. It's not that it's wrong, that zip codes, because zip code is a code itself for school quality, neighborhood effects, and role models, all kinds of things. So it picks up a lot of things, proxies that might be very difficult to measure. It could be a nice little index in itself. It might lead to one not having to control for a lot of covariates, which we might find if you control for zip code, you may not have to control for some of the other X's. So that would be my guess, but we haven't been able to get our hands on that data.
I hope
it's public data, but somehow, in the words of our you and I in the 70s, is being bogarted.
Okay, thank you so much. Hashim has a question. Would you like to ask that yourself?
It's going to pop up in a sec, I think.
Okay, great.
Well, can you hear me? Oh no, sorry. Can you hear me?
I can,
yes,
Hashim, John, yes.
Sorry, just a bit after. Well, thanks so much, as usual. It's a pleasure listening to you. It's a very difficult topic, obviously, you're addressing. I usually avoid difficult topics. And it's very good that you are challenged to do this. I mean, my difficulty was when I actually did early work on this, that Djavad kindly referred to, but I wrote a second paper, which came out in a Aspen, some collected volume. And there were, when I looked at how the regional effects in Iran. So it looked at different provinces and find out whether expenditure of government on education, or it's like a zip code, because a space is to do with the nature. If you have Baluchistan, it's a very bad zip code. If you are in north of Tehran, it's a good zip code. So therefore, if you look at a spatial analysis, basically you'll see that there are a lot of differences. So one of the question I'm raising now is that when I did that, obviously we knew that income distribution, you can't just look at the mean or the median, you're exactly right. So what people do usually those days, which I like your comment on, usually look at the top 10 to the bottom 10, the top 20 to the bottom 20, and so on. And we can try all sorts of top and bottom. I mean, this is what matters for inequality, not in middle of distribution. So median is definitely not the right thing to look at, and mean definitely not, you're right. So you can look at, there are ways of dealing with it, because I thought that dealing with the general distributions is always still have a choice how you choose those distributions. You didn't really expand on it. So therefore, if you then want to empirically estimate those distributions, as you pointed out, I think to another, then you have huge data sets to be able to fill up all the cells. And that brings me to the point of heterogeneity and dynamics, which has preoccupied me in seriously looking at these problems. Not only this problem, any problem for that matter. You did allude to that even for the same individual, you cannot compare the income of 70 to 21, which I agree. Then how would you compare income of in the same cohort, in the same zip code? I mean, so if you raise those issues, basically, in my view, is no way we can't answer them. So there has to be compromises made. And that's why I think you need to have you have to make assumption about heterogeneity. Which part of heterogeneity is purely dynamic, random? Which part of it is systematic? Therefore, you need to address. Otherwise, we'll never be able to actually resolve these problems, in my view. And the dynamics is really a complicated problem. So I thought I reflected on this because it's the, sort of although the mathematics you raised, they are accurate, and I agree that using a distance measure, Kullback lever is not a good idea. I think you agree with me. You have to use some measure, but there are so many different measures, distance you can. I mean, Jeffries had a measure of divergence, measure of distance, I mean, which base. So there are lots of measures. So I think at the end of the day, one has to relate it to the policy issues. So the choice of the metric has to relate to what people are worried about, not what mathematically is convenient. If you want to make headway, if you want to relate your work to the political discussion. And I think you looking at the top decile and the bottom decile, even very higher, more granular of what I'm just suggesting, maybe it's a better way. It may not be theoretically very neat, but I think it's practically more relevant. I was wondering what is your reflection on those, and how would I learn differently if I did what I just said? Naively look at the, if you say look at the top 1% to the bottom 1%, I'm happy to do that. Top 2% to bottom 2%. I keep doing it. I keep looking at it. Therefore, at the end of it, I look at the relevant part of the solution without making much of an assumption. And these are invariant to scale or everything you said, because it's ratio. Even if there is a dynamics, even if there is a growth rate, so long as the growth happens to the top and the bottom. I don't like Gini coefficient because it divides a measure of the difference by a denominator, which is could have trend in it. So it's a crazy measure over time. Anyway, I think enough. So
it's also not very sensitized to details. It misses a lot.
I didn't like it. I didn't like Gini.
So Hashem has raised a range of pretty deep questions. I'll try to pick at a few of them. The first was the how to determine these distributions. So in the interest of robustness, we don't assume any parametric forms. We always do them non-parametrically. But to your other point, the opportunity to try to flesh out the role of dynamics, role of growth, role of covariates. If one is willing to commit to a typical trade-off, functional form from quantiles. So every quantile is now parametrically, at least up to an index, is specified. We estimate those quantiles and then invert them to get the conditional distribution. It's pretty easy to get non-parametric distribution of covariates. That's done very robustly. The marginals are found very robustly. It's the conditional one. And the conditional one, both through inversion of quantiles, where you can bring in things that matter to you, covariates like zip codes, dynamics, role of neighborhoods, all sorts of things. And those quantiles will be estimated, bringing those considerations in at a cost, because you will have written a quantile function, right? One could these days do big data, and Blundell and Risa, I think a young co-author of his, recently looked at these regressions with the lasso and deep learning methods. And happily, we don't have a lot of covariates. So what we're talking about in terms of big data is many functionals, many polynomials of the same variables in interaction terms. They found that education and income still account for 67%. So it's not a huge loss, but at least it robustifies the specification, parametric specification of these quantiles or regressions. And then the inversion gives you a pretty good idea of the conditional distribution. Now, your other point is that this is in a way aspirational, because a lot of these cells are pretty thin. The data isn't there. And to aspire to do these distribution regressions or quantile regressions is one thing. To get them with reasonable accuracy, precision, is a massive problem. And that's what I was alluding to partly in responding to Nadir's comment. When these cells become thin, small, it's very difficult to have precise estimation. And this is why we often put this SEO, the Survey of Economic Opportunity data, because it sort of increases the data on the poor side, the low income side of the distribution. So we get more accurate results, more accurate picture of what is. But by no means do I take it lightly in terms of what precision we can offer with these technologies. Anytime you want to discover a distribution rather than its mean, you're asking a lot of the data, right? So that's the downside. One way to deal with that is go parametric, and we've been reluctant to do that so far because of robustness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Essi and Hoshed. I'm going to read 2 or 3 questions that are posted in the chat and the Q&A, and that should bring this session to an end, because we've gone over the customary 1.5 hour mark, but this is Iranian time, so we are allowed to go 20 minutes over. One question, I'm going to read the questions together, and then you can answer them at once. One question from an anonymous attendee asks, is that method applicable for separated cross-section data that are independent, but from the same population? Another question is asking, does this method allow you to identify the causes of high or low intergenerational mobility, and what would those be? And a third question asks, what would you say are the best data sets for calibrating models of intergenerational wealth mobility in the American context? Thank you, Essi.
The first question I missed, Djavad. What, something about cross-sectional data?
Right. You know, I guess the answer is you can't get a joint distribution out of 2 separate surveys, right?
Right. So you can't. They won't be paired. But I have views which we don't have time to go over about anonymous measures of even intergenerational mobility versus these paired values, partly because of data considerations, partly because I think one can adjust the types of policy questions that one wants to answer, and those don't require paired. I can characterize the joint distribution of a dynasty, compare it to another without pairing, estimate these things anonymously, and then compare the 2 outcomes anonymously. But it interferes with the second question. Can you identify causes? If you are trying to identify causes of transmission from one generation to their offspring, not from one generation to another, then you need data that have measurements on the covariates that I mentioned, those X's, the conditioning variables. That's your mechanism for identifying what matters, both in terms of dynamics, in terms of education, in terms of circumstances, all sorts of things. If you have measurements on them, that's where you go. In terms of wealth, I have a long story. I used to want to work on wealth as my PhD. Nietzschean ideas about what to do with inheritance and so on. And Terence Gorman told me to go do econometrics, forget about that. Later on, when I tried to do studies on wealth, I realized how shoddy our treatment was of zeros and negative wealth when people borrow, and the difficulty of high bracket non-reporting of wealth and things like that. Tony Sharroks was kind of my advisor on these things. He told me 2 things. One is that doing wealth studies was truly aspirational given the data problems and how we deal with those data issues. The other one was that essay do not propose another measure of inequality. So says to go do something else. So I think some really good wealth data for the Luxembourg panel in Europe and the Nordic countries have evolved. There are imputation methods that are used for the US data, and imputation methods are fraught. They're quite hard to I don't want to say believe in, but it's possible that things we find are artifacts of those imputation methods rather than the actual discovery of what the wealth distribution looks like. So I don't know if I answered all of the three components.
I can pose the first question a little bit differently, and I'm actually interested in getting your views on that. If you have different cross sections, maybe you can learn something about mobility through tracing cohorts. There is a literature, small literature that's coming out of the World Bank by Dang and his colleagues, where they use these pseudo panels to study mobility in and out of poverty. I wonder if you've seen that and what you think of that. And that will then end this talk.
So I haven't. With Zhong Jian, a young colleague, we are developing fillers for pseudo panels. I take characteristics in two different waves, and if we don't know the outcomes, I match individuals. I find twins, as it were, statistical twins, and then fill those missing waves to create pseudo panels like that. And that's very courageous imputational methods. I'm looking for my, forgive me, I'm looking for my juice so I don't run out of battery. Sorry. Okay, very good. So no, I have not seen that particular paper you mentioned, but imputation methods, there is also another imputation method that I love and I haven't had a student to bite, is to find the maximum entropy distribution of data by matching some moments. It's the ultimate calibration, but formally. And if you solve that problem, which is possible, you have a whole distribution you can draw from it. It's really like simulation, but from the maximum entropy distribution. I wish I could find a student who will bite and go ahead and do that. But all of them fall under imputed data methods, and imputations have consequences, especially imputations that depend on a model. So for instance, the workhorse of imputation methods is to find observations that still satisfy the same regression model, right? And so such data is not really useful for testing whether your model was correct to begin with. It's a big problem with imputation methods. But these are the methods, the sort of propensity score or my entropy method of matching are not model dependent. So they might hold some promise to solve some of these problems. But the ultimate solution is to collect data.
It is, yes. Well, thank you very much, Essie, for a wonderful talk. I also want to thank everybody else who was here for generating a very informative conversation. Hopefully we'll have another panel at some future time with more data on Iran, talking not about just the theory of mobility, but also about measurement. With this, I want to turn this back to Kamyar, who has something to say about what next is coming from IIEA.
Thank you so much, both, and merci, Esijun. Lots to think about there. Lots of, as Hashim said, it's tricky questions. Those are the best. Thank you so much, and thank you, Djavad, for excellent sharing. We're actually never been on time. In other words, Iranian time, 2 hours, but we managed this time, so that's perfect. Just want to say we look forward to seeing you in January. We have a excellent panel discussion on export diversification in Iran. Saleh has organized that. And then in February, we'll have a panel on climate change in Iran. and in March, sanctions in the Iranian economy, in April, oil and energy, and I can go on. So we have lots of interesting panel discussions and sessions. So we look forward to seeing you in January. And thank you very much for joining us today. Take care.
Thanks everyone. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Bye everyone.
Take care.